We have a very busy program all lined up for today for the winter wheat webinar series. So I want to get right to it. First of all, I want to say good morning to Jody Pollok-Newsom. Jody, good morning. How are you this morning?
I'm great. We've just been talking about it with the sun and everything. How can you not be great? And the wheat looks super. So I'm good.
Well, yeah, and you can go out at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, and you don't have to be all bundled up with the ear flaps and everything else. It was a beautiful morning. Very nice.
It was. We have our fair lamb. So I was doing the midnight bottle feedings because they're bottle babies. And I love that I don't have to get all bundled up just to go feed a couple bottles. So I'm loving the weather.
Hey, that's all right. And of course, it won't be too much longer, and we're going to see the wheat starting to green up just a little bit. So before we get everybody all fired up and they want to get out and get running, we got a little business to take care of. First of all, Jody, is the voting underway right now as far as the referendum goes?
So for the referendum right now is kind of a little quiet time. Everything is sent to the Department of Agriculture and they are working on the ballots. So everything is getting printed and stuff this week, and that should be mailed out to everybody next week. So,
that's great.
In process.
In process. And speaking in process, understand that our first guest this morning has been in process, sitting in front of his computer for days upon end. We're lucky to grab onto him this morning.
We are. Michigan is very lucky, both on a state level and a national level. For the Michigan Wheat Program, Dave Milligan from Cass City was one of our original board members. At the first board meeting, he got voted in as chairman of the Michigan Wheat Program, and he served as chairman the entire 9 years that he was on the board. So he just got term limited off last summer, but the board made a position to keep him on the board with all of his knowledge and all of his contacts. And at the same time he was on our board, he got very involved nationally, and those growers saw all the leadership and all the vision that he brought to the table, and they voted him on the officer chain for the National Association of Wheat Growers. And at their meeting 2 weeks ago, they voted him in for a second year as their national president. So we have wheat royalty right with us this morning.
Yeah, we sure do. Dave, good morning. How are you?
Morning, Terry. Good morning, wheat growers.
Hey, I'll tell you, that field looks pretty impressive behind you. I think that's going to be the wish of almost each and every one of us here come June.
Yeah, the picture is a little dated. Yeah, it's not today's picture.
No, not at all. Dave, tell us a little bit about what is going on nationwide as far as the wheat industry goes.
Well, first I want to talk a little bit about what National Wheat Growers are. We go by NOG. It's a member organization of 40 wheat growing states that really is a voice of wheat in Washington, D.C. And we joined, like Jody said, shortly after we formed the Michigan Wheat Program. And I think probably one of the real interesting things that back in 2008, and then really in 2009, we had a big falling numbers issue in Michigan, as if you remember that. And actually, National Association of Wheat Growers helped us out before we even joined that organization with that thing, and continued to do so as we worked through the process of getting crop insurance to cover that and cover it in a decent way. And we've actually had quite a bit of success with that. But you really want to know probably what's happened. The last 2 weeks ago, we met as a national group for our annual meeting. That was in person and virtual, like everything else is today. And we have a lot of issues we brought out, what kind of our priorities are for the year. And farm programs are still a major importance to all the wheat growers. What's happening at USDA, we've had some wins. We've got the new quality loss option for crop insurance. We really had some, I think, some real good COVID relief packages came out last year that were quite helpful to wheat growers, particularly the COVID-2 package. When COVID-1 came out, if you remember, not all classes of wheat got covered. None of the wheat that we grow in Michigan got covered. And NOG and a lot of other people, several senators and House of Representative members and several states were quite active in discussing with USDA and forming USDA, educating USDA. And we came out, when the COVID-2 package came out, all wheat varieties were covered, all classes. And if you look back and do the math, wheat growers in Michigan got an average of 33 cents a bushel. Now we figure that's a pretty good win. By the way, if you're paying NOG dues, we pay NOG dues. State of Michigan does for every bushel of wheat that is grown in the state. 1,000 bushel of wheat, the dues is 88 cents. So if you do the math, 1,000 bushel of wheat, the COVID relief package provide you $330. So it's really a good return on our investment. Looking ahead, other things that we don't want to forget about is trade. A year ago, before this pandemic hit, that was the big issue, and it's still a very important issue. Nationwide, about 50% of the wheat's exported. Not here in Michigan, because fortunately we have a lot of consumers that use the wheat right here in the state. But obviously, if it helps all wheat growers, there's more wheat we can export, makes more demand. We also need to be concerned about the infrastructure updates we need. We all know now that we need more rural band internet. As you're on Zoom and you get this little thing, you're unstable or you can't get on. But that's not the only infrastructure that needs to be updated. We need to, we need roadways, we need power systems, we need barges and locks and dams and railroads, because we've got to move this product and we got to be able to compete. Some of our competitive countries are updating their transportation systems. But probably the biggest thing that we all hear about anymore is climate change. And we hear that a lot. We've had a lot of change in Washington, D.C., change of presidents, change of House, Senate power, changes at USDA. So climate change and sustainability are really going to be a big item in this next few months and years as we look ahead. We as wheat growers feel we have a good story to tell in that we're growing something, right? And we're growing, we cover the ground most of the year. A growing crop sequesters carbon. But not to say we can't do better. As regulations come along, we want to be at the table. We want these regulations to be science-based. We want these regulations to be voluntary. And we want these programs to cover early adapters. If you've already started doing these practices, you should still be able to be eligible to benefit from these practices. And sustainability is right along with that. And there's cover crops and soil health are a big part of that. But if we're going to have sustainability and we're going to sequester carbon, we need to make sure that we still have the crop protection tools that we use. And we need dollars spent to research to keep improving wheat varieties, wheat practices. We certainly advocate for that, and we certainly have seen some benefit for that, but we certainly cannot forget that we need to keep moving forward. So it's a big agenda. We look forward to working with the new people we have in Congress. I don't know if Terry, you got any more questions, any comments? I got a couple minutes yet.
Yeah, I'm very interested, Dave, on your impression and really the group's impression nationwide about the selection of Tom Vilsack as the Secretary of Agriculture. We had a pretty dynamic individual the 4 years before, and he brought a lot of new things to the table. Now we have a new administration, and now we have a voice of agriculture that is familiar with us because he served as an ag director back several years ago. What's your impression, and what's the group's impression of Tom Vilsack?
We as an organization are very pleased to have Secretary Vilsack back at USDA. He's got a proven record. He's going to hit the ground running. I think he's been an advocate for farm producers. So yes, we're very fortunate to, I think, to have an experienced man of his leadership back in the USDA.
Have you had a chance to talk to him at all? Has the group had a chance yet?
Actually, I had a 2-minute conversation with him, maybe it's an introduction as part of Commodity Classic. The presidents of the corn, soybeans, sorghum, and wheat, and the equipment growers. We had about a 20-minute Zoom call with the Secretary of Agriculture. If we'd been at Commodity Classic, normal in person, we would have had a breakfast meeting with them. So this was the abbreviated version of that, very abbreviated, but yeah, we will hopefully have some face-to-face time down the road here.
You know, it's never too early to be thinking about the Farm Bill. And I really have to, with the changes in the House and the Senate, and we do have a lot of new members that have moved into those bodies. That's going to be quite an educational process, isn't it?
You're right. When I said change in Washington, we have change, and that's exactly right. And there's quite an education task ahead of us. In fact, we actually are going to start on that somewhat this afternoon or this morning. We actually have Zoom calls with all of the ag committees, both House, Senate, majority and minority. So yes, it's a big task, and like I think you alluded to, every year we get further away from the people that have had real experience on farms.
I guess I'm just real curious again if there's going to be an opportunity down the road for you, we here in Michigan, to host some of these folks, bring them into our fields and have a little get together yet this year.
We certainly open the door to that. We'd like to see it happen.
Yep, we sure would. We'd love to see them here and host them here in our state. We're very proud of our industry, Dave, and I know you carry that torch very well, and we really appreciate everything that you have done. And feel free to ask Dr. Berry some questions, okay?
Okay.
All right, Dave, thank you very much. Dennis, come on in. Dennis Pennington, how are you this morning?
Great, good. Good morning, Terry.
And we've got a special guest from across the pond, right?
Yes, we do. We're very fortunate to have somebody with the expertise that Pete brings with us. So yeah, Pete is a crop physiologist. He's worked with ADAS for 18 years in the United Kingdom. He's the head of the crop physiology team. He's worked on a wide range of projects, including optimizing nitrogen nutrition on crops, exploitation of precision farming technologies, lodging control, and plant growth regulation and development of reliable pest thresholds. So, and he works on a range of crops, wheat being one of them. And I think wheat may be primary crop there. I've had a chance to work with Pete over the last few years with a project here in the U.S. And so he's actually been able to travel to Michigan and see some of our research plots that we have. So he's just a wealth of knowledge and expertise, and I think we're in for a treat. So yeah, Pete, welcome.
And we'll want to encourage our viewers that if they do have any questions for Dr. Berry, that they can go down to the bottom of their screen if they're on Zoom and click on the Q&A. And if they're watching us on Facebook, they can just type in the comments of Facebook, and we'll be able to handle some of those questions a little bit later on.
Yes. Right, Pete, the show is yours. Welcome.
Good
Thank
morning.
you, Dennis.
Good morning.
And thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So I'm going to share my screen now with everybody.
Looks good.
Yep, looks real good, Doctor.
How does that look?
Great.
Excellent. Good. Well, as by way of background, in the 1990s and 2000s in Europe and the UK, our wheat yields were plateauing. And there was a lot of discussion about whether we'd reached the yield potential for our regions. And that's really where we come into this as a group, in the group that I lead, to try and understand how we could enhance yields in Europe and the UK. So I'm going to start my talk by summarising the work we've been doing over recent years in Europe and the UK to enhance yields. And then we'll have a pause, an opportunity for a few questions. And then I'll focus on your region. So, like I said, in the 2000s, there was a sense that certainly in Europe and the UK, we might actually be reaching our yield potential for the environment and for our varieties. So we're thinking, well, can we actually increase yield any more? And at this time, the world wheat world record was broken by this man here, Mike Solari from New Zealand. He achieved 235 bushels per acre, an incredible yield, really. And it got us thinking. We got in touch with Mike. We started to understand how he was growing his crop and what environment he was growing in. We could quantify how much sunlight his crop got, how much water it had access to, how much nitrogen fertilizer was applied to the crop, quite a lot, as you can see, £400 per acre there. But we looked at the figures and we thought, you know, this isn't that different from the UK environment here. Yes, he's getting a bit more sun. He hasn't got as much water, but his yields are much more than we get. So are we really reaching the yield plateau in the UK and Europe, given that this guy is getting such a massive yield? So this is our inspiration, really. The first thing we wanted to do was think, what is our yield potential back in Europe and the UK? And we calculated this just based on the environment that our crop grows in, the amount of light it has and the amount of water. So if you know those things, you know how much your crop can capture, you know the efficiency rate that it can convert sunlight and water into total biomass, and you know what proportion of biomass could be partitioned to the yield, then you know what your potential yield is. It's not rocket science, we can work it out. So we set about doing this for the UK and Europe. We looked firstly at the capture of light, just how much light can our crops capture? And we reckoned that the maximum our wheat crop could capture over the whole year was about 60% of the total sunlight. So that's a crop being established in September and it's harvested in August, and you have about 2 weeks to harvest it and cultivate the soil and establish another crop. So that's about the maximum we think we can manage. And then in terms of a water capture, we reckon the maximum we could expect is that our crops could get 75% of the water stored in the soil to a depth of about 6 feet. I think any more, we're pushing it too much. And we know that we've got the tools in the toolbox to manipulate and control these factors. So we can use crop nutrition, disease control, cultivations to help the crop to capture more of these things, the light and the water. And then we thought about the conversion efficiency. How good is our crop at converting light to biomass? And looking at the published scientific literature, we know that the maximum that a wheat can manage is about 1.4 tons of biomass for every terajoule of light it intercepts. And then in terms of water use efficiency, it can produce about 5.5 tons of biomass for every 4 inches of water transpired. So that sort of sets your limits really for conversion efficiency. And then from the total biomass that your crop produces, we reckon the maximum proportion of that could be partitioned to yield is about 60%. Anything more, you really haven't got enough stem biomass to hold the crop up, and it's going to be prone to lodging. So we think 60% of your total biomass could be yield. And again, you know, as farmers, we've got tools that we can control these factors, such as variety, fungicides, and PGRs. So we used this information to figure out what our yield potential really is. And this is summarized here, where in that pink line, you've got the light energy during the year, starting September and ending in September. And the green line is how much of that light a typical crop in the UK would intercept. So a good yielding crop in the UK will intercept just under 50% of the light over the whole year. But we reckon we can do better than that by getting our crop to start expanding its canopy a bit earlier, and more importantly, keeping the canopy greener for longer towards harvest. We can get our crop to intercept more light. And we think that 60% is the max that we can achieve. If we can achieve that, then we're going to create a total biomass of about 11 tonnes per acre. And if 60% of that is partitioned to the yield, we've got a yield of 320 bushels of grain. So that's a massive yield, you know, given the average UK yield is about 120 bushels. So it's, you know, it's more than twice that. And when we first put this out into the public domain, there was a bit of skepticism about it. You know, is this really possible? But as you'll see later, some of the farmers in our yield competitions are starting to get towards this figure. So it's definitely not pie in the sky. So it looked like, you know, we could get high yields. We've got a good environment for getting high yields. Why aren't we getting them? So we set up this yield enhancement network, or YEN, to try and figure out how we could close that gap between what we were achieving and what the potential was. The aims were to identify farm innovators and support them with their innovating, because we had seen so many farmers with great ideas for improving their yields, but they were just lacking some support to convert those great ideas into profit. So that was the essence of this, really. And the activities we had within this network were a yield competition, which I know you're familiar with, you have one over there. Analysis of the data which collected in that competition, networking and developing ideas to improve yield, and then testing those ideas. And it's a network of farmers, scientists, industry, everybody's involved. And it's really got to put a bit more flesh on those bones of how the network works. It really starts with the science, the understanding of how wheat grows, what controls yield formation. And that really tells us what things we need to measure in the crop to understand how it's achieving its yield. So the yield competition is this next bit, is a bit on the top right there. We've had, as you'll see, hundreds and thousands of farmers entering the yield competition. They collect lots of things about the crop, which helps us to understand how the crop is achieving its yield. At the end of the year, each entrant or farmer receives a 25-page report which explains in great detail how their crop performed, where it did well, where it didn't do so well, where the sort of constraining factors were for not achieving a higher yield. So by analysing all that data, we can see what are the constraining factors. And the next step is really, how can we overcome those constraining factors? What changes do we need to make to how we grow the wheat to overcome those problem areas? And that's not an easy thing. You know, it takes a real joint effort to come up with some good ideas. So this part of it is really getting the farmers, the scientists, the industry all together to come up with some good ideas. And then the final element is testing those ideas and testing them on a field scale in a commercial setting that's relevant to farming. So we have a great sort of emphasis on testing lots of ideas at the right scale, using lots of different farmers to do those tests. So that's how it works. It's been running for 9 years now. We've had well over 1,000 grower entrants altogether, most of them in the UK, Scotland, Ireland and Wales, but quite a few in neighbouring European countries as well. You can see there on the right all the different measurements that we take. Quite a large number of them, obviously yield and the yield components, but you know, lots of aspects that we can use to understand how the yield is being formed and what the constraining factors might be. Now, in 2015, one of our yen entrants actually beat the world wheat record. He achieved 248 bushels per acre. And you know, as before, we're able to understand how he did it, how much light he had available, what the water supply was from the rainfall and the soil storage. It was 18.5 inches. How much fertilizer nitrogen was applied, it's 290 bushels per acre. Just for sort of context, the typical amount of fertilizer applied in the UK is about 200 pounds of N per acre. And we also worked out the potential yield of Tim's crop, given the resources that his crop had available. And he was rightly proud of his world record, but he didn't seem quite as happy when we told him he could have done better, because the potential yield we estimated was 336 bushels per acre, and that would be 80%. So he achieved about 80% of that yield potential. An incredible achievement, really, because we don't expect anybody to actually achieve the yield potential at the moment. It's something for the future, really. We will need better varieties, better agronomic technology to achieve that potential. So Tim already is achieving 80% of it, which is a great achievement. When we should say that the world wheat record now is held by New Zealand again, by Eric Watson, with a yield of 261 bushels per acre, set just last year. So we've got this big data set of yields and explanatory factors. We can analyse that data to understand what general factors have the biggest influence on yield. And it comes up with some interesting results. So you find that, as you might expect, season explains 90% of the variation in yield amongst the 1,260 yield entrants we've had over the years. Soil type explains 11%, previous crop 6%, interactions with season, various factors explains a big chunk. But interestingly, there's a farm factor here, farmer and farm factor, which explains almost a quarter of the yield variation. And what this means is that you can have two farmers farming in a similar region, similar soil type, but they're achieving, one farm consistently achieves a much greater yield than the other farm. Now, why is that? What is that farmer doing differently to achieve a better yield? It's not down to the soil type or the environment. It's down to the farmer's decisions and what the farm's doing. So we looked at this in a bit more detail. We held a few sort of workshops with a wide range of farmers to try and understand what characteristics help certain farms achieve more than others. And this is a summary of what we found. Quite a few characteristics, as you might expect, and I'll focus on the ones highlighted in red there, and look first at the attention to detail one. That does come up time and time again, that high yields aren't just about large amounts of inputs, they're about how you use those inputs and timing them at exactly the right growth stage. Attention to detail seems to be really important for getting a high yield. Many of those farmers had a trusted circle of advisors that they'd built up over the years that they used regularly. They also did a lot of measurement of their crop and benchmarking and comparison with neighbours and other farms around the country. And I think that is really important. The old adage of you can't manage what you don't measure is really apt here. And a lot of the high yielding farmers were taking a lot of time to really understand and benchmark their crops. Also, they did a lot of testing of new ideas. And I think that is incredibly important, that if you're going to improve the crop management, you need to be doing the tests. And they were certainly unafraid of any fails of tests. They just saw that as knowledge in the bank. You know, if it doesn't work, that's fine. It's been a useful thing doing it, not a waste of time. We'll store that information up for the future. They might not have tried that failed test in the front field in front of a farmhouse, mind you, but generally they weren't afraid of it. Other more specific factors associated with high yield include regular manuring, history of manuring on the fields. So that could be farmyard manures, animal manures. It could be other organic materials such as anaerobic digestate. That comes up a lot as being associated with higher yields. Greater soil phosphate. You know, I think there is an issue in the UK certainly about, it's not just not having enough in the soil, it's actually having the plant having it available to plant uptake and the plant getting hold of it. So there's two issues there. Is the soil supply enough? And secondly, can the plant actually get hold of it? Narrow row widths. I think this is more about avoiding row widths which are too wide. So anything above 8 to 9 inches, we were seeing a yield drop off. And I think this is because it takes longer for the crop to reach its full crop cover and intercept as much light. Greater nitrogen rates. I mean, this wasn't a strong association, but it was nonetheless statistically significant that you do find that high yielding crops tended to have more nitrogen applied to them. More fungicide applications. This isn't bigger doses, it's more frequent applications of fungicides, which are associated with high yields, and more plant growth regulator applications. And we should emphasize that these factors aren't necessarily causing the high yields, they're associated with the high yields. So whether it's a high yielding crop achieved its high yield because more PGRs were applied, or more PGRs were applied because the crop had a high yield potential, we don't know. But nonetheless, all these factors are associated with high yields. Crop characteristics associated with high yield were just a large overall biomass. So you tend to find if you've got a world record grain yield, you've probably got a world record straw yield as well. More heads per square yard, that's really important. And that's in the UK, the most important yield component associated with high yields. But also we did find positive associations with more kernels per head and more kernel weight. And also we find that generally taller crops were associated with high yields. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the UK and Europe, and work we've been doing here to try and improve and understand yield enhancement. In 2016, we were invited by BASF to do a similar exercise of estimating the yield potential in your region. And we started this off by looking at the weather conditions that you experience and comparing those with the UK. And as you can see there, you know, compared to the UK, the region you're in is experiencing more sunlight. It's getting at least as much rain, but it is warmer, cooler winters, warmer summers. Now, all that together resulted in a pretty similar yield potential to the UK. You know, you've got a really good growing environment for wheat there. Certainly the sunshine is really important. You've got lots of it in the summer. It's going to really help increase the yields. You've got adequate rainfall, too much you might argue sometimes. But the warmth is a problem. You know, it's a bit warm in the summer, and that's a problem because warmer conditions accelerates the crop development and shortens the time over which it can carry out photosynthesis and accumulate biomass. So that's a problem, but the greater sunlight more than compensates for the warmer conditions. So your yield potentials are similar to ours in the UK. And if you graph that up, the blue columns are the current yields, the orange ones are the achievable yields, which we think are achievable using current varieties and current agronomic technology. And you can see they're quite similar, albeit there's a bigger gap between the current yields and the achievable yields in your neck of the woods. And then we also estimated the ultimate potential yield that your environment could support. Now, we don't expect to achieve that with today. You'd need better varieties, better agronomic technology to be able to achieve these yields, but this is an ultimate target. And you can see there they're similar between our two countries at around 250 bushels per acre. So, you know, we think there is potential to really get some high yields. The question is now, which I'll come on to next, is how to achieve that. But I'll pause there now and just invite one or two questions if there are any.
Yeah, Pete, we do have a few questions in here. I'll just ask a couple of them if that's all right.
Yeah.
First, what type of wheat was the record holder or record wheat holder planting, and what was his seeding rate?
Yeah, so in the UK we have about half of our wheat is feed wheat and half of it is for bread making. That particular variety that Tim grew was a feed variety. His seeding rate now, it would have been between 250 and 300 seeds per meter squared. So that equates to about 125 to 150 kilograms of seed per hectare. So kilograms per hectare and pounds per acre, you know, not that dissimilar. So you might be looking at 125 to 150 pounds an acre.
Yeah.
I mean, he's trying to get about 200 plants per meter squared. That's his target for the establishment.
Yeah, so that's a similar seeding rate to what we would have here in Michigan, or what we're planting here in Michigan.
Yeah.
Yep. Next question, 400 pounds of nitrogen is aggressive. Are you using products like Palisade to slow growth and help with lodging problems?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, that is a very high rate, and Tim in our country applied just under 300 pounds of N per acre. Tim will have used probably 3 plant growth regulators throughout the life of his crop. He'll have put 3 separate plant growth regulators on to try and counteract the increased risk of lodging. So yes, growth regulators are an important part of the high yield program.
Okay, I do have a couple other questions if you want to take them, or if you want to keep moving, that's fine with me.
Well, let's take them and then we'll move on.
Okay. All right. When measuring these record yields, is loss from the combine considered? Because the actual yield could be larger.
It could. That's right. I mean, we don't really. We actually have a yield competition in peas, and we do bother to check the yield losses from the combine in that crop. But for the other crops, there's obviously some losses, but we assume they're negligible.
Okay. Do many UK wheat farmers broadcast their seed? And if so, what are the results?
Yeah, none. It's all drilled in rows. Sometimes you get them kind of broadcast within the row, and you might have a strip which is maybe 2 or 3 inches wide, but you've still got them in rows effectively. So no, broadcasting is not part of the management process.
Okay. how much no-till wheat, or how much no-till is used in planting wheat, minimum till versus conventional till? Any idea?
Zero till is not commonly used, but increasing in frequency. I would say only maybe 5% of wheat is zero tilled in. Nearly all of it is min tilled. Probably about 20% is still inversion tillage, ploughed and tilled.
Okay. At what growth stages are the PGRs applied?
Yeah, so early stem extension to flag leaf. So Feeks growth stage 5 up to the flag leaf, but the majority are applied at Feeks growth stage 5, 6, 7.
Okay. There are two more. If you, is that?
We'd better move on. I think that's, we'll pick
We'll
them up
come
at the
back to
end,
them.
shall we? Yeah, all right. All right, thanks for those questions. Good questions. Right, so let's move on to the second part then and think, how can we bridge that gap between current yields and what's the potential? Now, to do this, I'm going to summarize an initiative which we've been carrying out with BASF called the Max Wheat Yield Initiative, or MWY, as you'll see it abbreviated later. And it's a series of farm trials which have been carried out between 2017 and 2020. We started in the Great Lakes region, mainly Michigan and Ohio, some in Kentucky and Tennessee as well. 44 trials in total over the 4 years. And we also branched out into the Pacific Northwest over the last couple of years, where we did 17 trials. So a pretty substantial number of trials. And in each trial, we had these treatments. So we had what we call obviously a farm standard to compare the new treatment against. We had treatment 2, which was extra nitrogen fertilizer, a total extra of 60 pounds per acre, and that was applied at growth stage 5 and growth stage 7, so 30 pounds each growth stage. The third treatment was the extra N plus extra fungicide, and that was applied at growth stage 7 and the flag leaf, and that was Prioxar applied there. The fourth treatment was extra nitrogen, extra fungicide, and extra late N applied at the flag leaf. And then the fifth and final one was all those extra crop inputs plus a plant growth regulator, which was Palisade applied as a split application at growth stage 5 and 7. So you can see it's a pretty comprehensive trial, and hats off to all the farmers who managed to get all that done. And just to give you a bit of sort of background as the sort of farmers and the yields they were getting who did the trials. So what we can see here is the yield in bushels per acre, and this is the farm standard yield. And you can see that on average, it's just under 100 bushels per acre, fluctuates a bit in different years, but it's quite a bit above the regional average of about 80 bushels per acre. So we were working with some very good growers who are already achieving some very good yields. That's the thing to emphasize here. The N equals 3 number is the number of trials that make up that average. So you can see we're ramping up to 19 trials by 2018-19. Now, if we add on the best treatment yield in each trial, you can see that even though we're working with some very good farmers who achieved some very good yields, we were still able to increase the yields further by on average 13 bushels per acre. So you can see that there's still scope to push those yields further. If we look now at the specific treatments, and we look firstly at the additional nitrogen fertilizer, then you can see that the average yield increase from the extra nitrogen was 7.3 bushels per acre. It varies a bit between the seasons. I think we should highlight the 2018-19 season as being particularly challenging, with it as being so wet in the spring. it was difficult for the farmers to get all of the nitrogen treatments on. So quite a few could only put on one of these splits on and only put an extra 30 pounds of N per acre on. But that's, you know, a reality, isn't it? You can't always get the applications on as you want them because of the weather. And then if you move on to the fungicides, the extra fungicide also gave an extra 7 bushels per acre. And again, you can see a sort of variation between the seasons. And again, you know, there's a challenge in 2019 with the weather preventing some of the applications going on. Then in 2020, we simplified the protocol a bit because we could see that the nitrogen and fungicide were doing the business. So we put them together as a single treatment. And we also had a second treatment 3 here, which was the extra nitrogen, extra fungicide, and the PGR, because we really wanted to drill down into the PGR to understand whether that could help or not. And then if we look at the average yields across the 14 trials that we did in the Great Lakes region in 2020, but you can see that the farm standard, again, was averaging 96 bushels per acre. And the extra nitrogen and the extra fungicide added an extra 10.4 bushels per acre. The PGR had no effect on average, and that was consistent with the other seasons as well. We didn't see that much lodging. So that's the main reason why we didn't see a PGR benefit. If we look at an example of one of the trials, you can see from the aerial photo, we've got the farm standard strip here. It looked really clear in the field, but probably not quite as clear from this photo, but you can see, I can see that the nitrogen plus fungicide treatment is a bit darker green there. And then if we look on the right-hand side, this aerial image taken by a drone, then we can see that it's an image of a vegetation index called the NDVI, and the greener and bluer the colour, the larger and greener the canopy. So you can see that these strips which have the extra nitrogen and the extra fungicide are much bluer and greener than the neighbouring farm standard strips. So you can see, you know, there's a clear effect in the field from increasing the N and the fungicide. Then if we look at the yields, then farm standard on this particular example gave 95 bushels per acre, and the additional nitrogen and the additional fungicide increased that by 15 bushels per acre. So pretty sizable yield increase. And the PGR had no significant benefit. Now, in this trial, we were actually able to use the raw combine yield map data. And this was really useful because it allowed us to statistically analyze the data and test whether the treatment significantly increased yield. And that's important because by doing that, it gives us confidence that the effects of the treatments on yield are real. Because it is quite easy to fool yourself with these strip trial tests. It's very easy to just inadvertently position the trials on an area of the field where there's a different soil type. So you can't quite tell whether the treatment effect is caused by the different soil type or the treatment itself. And we've developed a system at ADAS where you can take the combine yield map data and analyze it so that it disentangles yield effects caused by underlying soil variation in the field from the yield effects caused by the treatment. So it disentangles that, and you can be certain that whether or not the yield effect is caused by the treatment. It's all about confidence, really. We want to do trials that give us results that we know are right, and this is a way of doing that. So as part of the work as well in these trials, there were lots of other measurements taken, including the kernel protein concentration, which was shown to be increased by 1% by the extra N. The test weight was increased by 2 pounds per bushel. There were no effects of the treatments on Hagberg falling number or vomitoxin levels. The disease at flowering was reduced from 30% of the leaves infected to just 10%. Now that is a massive reduction, because we know that every percentage of leaf area which is diseased at flowering reduces the yield by 1 bushel per acre. So just small differences in the disease levels at flowering make a big difference to the yield at the end of the day. We were seeing a bigger ground cover at flowering, which helps with the light interception, and there was little lodging in the trial, which explains really why we didn't see a PGI effect. Now, across all the trials that we did in the Max Wheat Yield Initiative, we measured the grain components, and the grain components are the number of heads per square foot, the number of kernels per head, and the weight of each individual kernel. And what we did was this: we compared the data from the Great Lakes with the UK data. And you can see, interestingly, that your crops actually have more heads than we have in the UK. But where the big difference occurs is the number of kernels per head is less and the kernel weight is less. So that's probably telling us where perhaps the focus needs to be for helping to increase yields. So in conclusion from that Max Wheat Yield Initiative, we should emphasize that we were dealing with some very good farmers who were achieving some very good farm standard yields, and yet we were still seeing the potential to increase yields by 7 bushels with extra nitrogen and by another 7 bushels from extra fungicide. In 2020, we put those two together and we were seeing an average yield increase of 10 bushels per acre, up to 22 bushels per acre for the maximum. We weren't seeing any consistent benefits from the PGR or the late N applied at flag leaf. Although in the few situations where we did see lodging, the PGR did increase yield in those circumstances. And our analysis of the components of yield indicated that focusing on getting more kernels per head and a larger kernel size are important. So I'm going to finish off by thinking about what are the actions that we should be looking at taking to try and enhance yield. And these actions apply to the UK and Europe and the US as much as ever. So I'm going to start by picking up on the yield component part. So if you remember, it was the kernels per head and the kernel size which are the important things to focus on. So thinking firstly about the kernels per head. Now, there's 2 aspects to the kernels per head. One is the number of spikelets per head. And if you look at this photograph here, then you can see the spikelets in the head. And typically, you might have between 8 and 12 rows of spikelets in a head. Now, we know this can vary between varieties. You get varieties with large heads and lots of spikelets. We also know that lower plant populations, lower seed rates will give you larger heads and more spikelets. So I think you could try and help to increase kernels per head through variety choice. I think there's limited scope for improving it by establishing lower plant populations, because you trade off against the number of heads per square foot. So, you know, you just end up with a trade-off there. So overall, I think there's limited scope for getting more spikelets per head. Where the big potential lies really is the number of kernels per spikelet. So if we look at this picture here, we've got a spikelet, a typical spikelet here. It's got 3, possibly 4 kernels within it. So it's a typical spikelet, 2 or 3 kernels, but spikelets could have as many as 9 kernels in them. And the reason they don't have more is because a lot of the kernels are aborted very early on in their life cycle. And they're aborted because the crop isn't photosynthesizing enough to support their development. So it starts off with 9 potential kernels, and then there's a critical period between the flag leaf and flowering when a lot of them are aborted. But you can minimize abortion by maximizing the photosynthesis of the crop during that key period. So by minimizing disease, making sure the crop has adequate nutrition, you can minimize the level of abortion of those kernels during that period. So photosynthesis is important during that period, all described here. There's things you can't control, like the weather, of course. You know, if it's very wet during pollination, you're going to reduce the number of kernels per spikelet. And then if we move on to kernel size, so that's obviously determined from flowering onwards. And this is more about how long you can keep the leaves alive and photosynthesizing for. So every extra day that you can keep the canopy green, that will equate to an extra 3 bushels per acre on average. So you don't need to change things that much to make a significant difference to yield. And again, weather has an effect. Cooler temperatures extend the period of kernel filling and are associated with heavier kernels. If we turn our attention now to nutrition, I think the message here really is to be vigilant for any deficiency symptoms. If you can see deficiency symptoms, you're quite a long way suboptimal in terms of the fertilizer management. And I think we should be looking at both nitrogen and sulfur, especially given that we don't get any free sulfur deposited from the atmosphere anymore, or very little. As you know, deficiency symptoms for nitrogen are the oldest leaf looking pale and yellow. Deficiency symptoms for the sulfur are the youngest, newest emerged leaf looking pale and yellow. It's important not to underestimate just how much nitrogen a high yielding crop needs. So a crop yielding 150 bushels per acre will be expected to take up about 200 pounds of N per acre from both the soil and the nitrogen fertilizer applied. As a rule of thumb, you'll need an extra 2 pounds of N per acre for every extra bushel of yield. Multiple splits of fertilizer become more important as you get higher dose rates of fertilizer. Putting it all on early could lead to issues, and it has done in the UK, whereby you get a lot of early tillers, but then the crop runs out of nitrogen and it loses a lot of those tillers. So the final head number is not that great. So by splitting the nitrogen applications and putting some on during stem extension, that can help to retain as many tillers as possible. Also, delaying some of the N helps to reduce the risk of lodging. Disease control. I think this is really important. From my visit to the region, I was interested to see that disease is around, and I think this is something to focus on. What is important to recognise with disease is that it's the top 3 leaves of a plant which are contributing 80% of the yield. So it's absolutely critical to keep these leaves clean and disease-free. And in the UK, that's what the fungicide programme is really focused on. It's focused on the first nitrogen application going on as leaf 3, this leaf here, the 3rd leaf down. As soon as that's emerged, a fungicide goes on to keep that leaf clean. And then the next fungicide goes on just as the flag leaf is emerged to keep that clean. So that's what the programme's geared towards. And that's illustrated here really. This is a typical UK fungicide programme. 100% of the crops receive a fungicide at flag leaf and 100% at growth stage 7, which is when leaf 3 is fully emerged. And that's to keep those top 3 leaves clean. A proportion of crops will also receive an earlier fungicide, particularly if the risk of rust is high. I should say that our main disease is septoria leaf spot. And a large proportion of crops also receive a fungicide at flowering, partly to control head blight, but also because we've got such a long growing season, then the flag leaf fungicide can run out of steam while the leaves are still alive. So we need to put another fungicide on after that to get the maximum disease control. With disease control, it's just important to remember that fungicides are generally protectant in their activity. So the best thing to do with them is to apply just as the leaf has fully emerged, coat it with the fungicide, and it acts as a protectant, and it's helping to prevent new disease from gaining an infection in that leaf. And that can last for a few weeks in activity. They're not very curative. So if disease has already established itself, then its curative properties aren't as good, and there's a rapid fall off in activity. And the longer the disease has already been established for, the lower the level of activity for its curative effects. So it's important to recognize that when it comes to timing the fungicides. And in the UK, and some of these sort of principles might apply with you, common weaknesses in programs are that the growth stage 7 fungicide is applied too early. It's before that leaf 3 has emerged, so it's not protecting the leaf 3. Disease can get into leaf 3 more easily. Or it's applied too late. Leaf 3 has already emerged, disease has already come in, its curative activity isn't great, so it's not controlling the disease very effectively. Similarly, for the next fungicide, we can easily apply the growth stage 9 or flag leaf fungicide too early. The leaf hasn't emerged, it's not going to control and offer protectant activity on that leaf. And again, similarly for being too late. If disease has already got into leaf 3, the flag leaf, then a late application is going to have limited curative activity in controlling it. The other element of disease control is to recognize the latent disease infection and unseen damage. So once a leaf is infected by a disease, it will be several days before symptoms are visible, but the fungus will be developing inside the leaf tissue, doing damage and reducing the crop's ability to photosynthesize. So you can illustrate that here with, you've got an untreated leaf here, you can see the fungal hyphae developing inside the leaf tissue, damaging its ability to be able to photosynthesize, compared with the fungicide treated leaf, which is largely clean. So really the messages are with fungicide control, targeting it at the growth stages which have the biggest effect on yield, and that's keeping the top 3 leaves clean and applying at growth stage 7 and 9. That's what we're doing in the UK. And my sense is that there's often in your programs quite a big gap between the first fungicide, which goes on maybe at early stem extension, and then the next fungicide might not be until flowering. So you've got a big interval there when disease can get in. First priority is to protect the flag leaf. That's the one that contributes the most to yield. It's easy for me to say apply on time, but when you've got thousands of acres to treat, you might be planting something else, maybe planting corn or something like that, or the weather's not conducive for going on the crop. So that's easier said than done, I know. But timeliness is really important nonetheless for getting the best control. Don't allow too big a gap between fungicide applications. Sort of rule of thumb in the UK is about 3 weeks. Adjust the doses according to different conditions. So if you've got a very resistant variety, then you probably still need a fungicide, you just don't need as much of it. Recognizing that fungicides can also extend the leaf area duration. So a number of fungicide actives do have a physiological property. Pyraclostrobin is one of them, which can extend the green area duration. And of course, timing the flowering spray carefully to preserve grain quality and minimize head blight. As you do, you're really hot on that, I've seen. And the final slide I want to finish with is an action for more field scale testing. I think it's key to identify the best crop management. Every farm and even every field are a bit different. So lots of testing, I think, is needed on individual farms to work out the best crop management strategy for your farm, because they're all so different. What we found with our max wheat yield program of trials was that it's really helpful if the treatment strips can be replicated. So if you can have at least 2 of each treatment, that gives you much more confidence in the results that you see. As I said, it's really important to position those strip trials really carefully within the field, because it's very easy to put one strip on a different soil type compared to the neighbouring strip. So looking back at old soil maps, aerial images, yield maps, you can use any of those things to help to put the trial in a part of the field which allows a fair comparison between the treatments. Making use of combine yield map data to be able to statistically analyse the yield data so you can test whether there's a statistical effect of the treatment is really important. We want to know that the results are real, and have confidence in them. And then finally, in the UK, we're setting up sort of groups of farmers who are testing similar treatments, and then they're sharing the results. And there's much more confidence if, say, 4 out of 5 farmers are seeing a similar result. So by getting groups of farmers together to do similar tests, I feel like we're sort of all gaining. Okay, I'll finish there and really thank all the farmers who were involved in the trials that we worked on over the last few years, and welcome any questions.
All right, fantastic. Nice job, Pete. We really appreciate that. Harry, you got any wrap-up comments here?
Just real quick, before we get to some of the questions, and boy, we'll be answering questions for an hour. Doctor, I hope you have a second cup of coffee there with you. We want to remind each and every one of our viewers that the credits, that'll be done here. Dennis will take care of that a little bit later on. So bear with us as far as that goes. But I don't think you're going to be bored at all, because we do have a lot of questions. And before we say goodbye, just briefly, Jody, thank you very much for being a part of the program again today, and again for all our producers to pay attention and get that voting taken care of, right?
Right, ballots will be going out in the next week, so they got to be done and postmarked by April 2nd. And also too, if folks want to go back, I got some emails to see some of these presentations again. Those are on our website under education, previous events. So if there's something that you're not quite sure you heard right, you can go back and hear all that again.
Fantastic. Jody, thank you very much. You take care, all right? Dennis, back to you. We've got a lot of questions. I would imagine some of them are probably duplicate questions, but let's go through as many of them as we possibly can, okay?
All right. So Pete, what I would suggest maybe the plan that we told everybody is that we would wrap this up by 9:30. So I have about 9:25. I got just a couple slides to go through to show them or to explain how to get their credits that they're looking for. And then what I thought we'd do is maybe we can answer questions between now and 9:25. And then I'll wrap up the credits. And then for those that want to hang around, we'll finish up answering questions that we have. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Sounds good. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So yes, and if any of you have additional questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box down below, and we'll answer them as we get to them. So, all right. So we'll start off with, we had a couple that we didn't get to in the first segment, but we'll go ahead and try to get to them now. First question, the UK likely has more tillering at those seeding rates. How many heads per square meter?
Yeah, I mean, we actually have a similar number of heads to you, or slightly less even. Typically, we're getting 500 heads per square meter. Yeah, it's not a huge number.
And what seeding rates are you using to get that?
Yeah, well, we're targeting typically about 200 plants per square metre, and we're probably sowing between 250 and 300 seeds per metre squared.
Okay. So
yeah, a typical establishment rate is about 78%.
Yeah. So you are seeding at a lower actual seeding rate, because that 250 is probably right around that 1 million seeds per acre, 1.2 million seeds per acre, that we would be planting. Yeah. And we generally start at like 1.4. Some will go as low as 1.2, and then later in the season we go on up to into November. If we're planting in November, even as high as 2.2 or 2.4 million seeds per acre.
Yeah, we do the same. Yeah, I mean, if we're sowing in mid-September, we might only be trying to establish 150 plants per square metre and sowing 200 seeds per square metre, and we'll be doing double that if we're sowing at the end of October, early November.
Okay, good. Next question. Taller shoots and more nitrogen are associated with higher yield. So should we go for high nitrogen levels and avoid dwarf varieties or the shorter varieties, and combine with a PGR? And would you just comment on that?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's important to recognise that high yielding crops do need more nitrogen fertiliser, and you can't really get away from the fact that you're going to end up with a higher lodging risk. So, you know, we have found when we've done nitrogen studies and PGR studies together that they work synergistically in the UK at least. That the more nitrogen you put on, or using a PGR allows you to put a bit more nitrogen on and gain extra yield potential. Variety-wise, and whether to use a sort of shorter variety, certainly the growers with the highest yields aren't really using the lodging-prone varieties. They're going for sort of medium or high lodging resistant varieties.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Next question. What type of seeder is typically used in the UK?
Well, a whole range, really. I mean, typically we've got row widths of about 6 inches. I mean, they're usually sort of single pass with a sort of cultivating down to about 10 or 15 centimetres, 6 inches depth, with a, you know, following that straight up with a drill. But we're using a whole range. You know, there's such a wide range of soil types, from blowing sand to heavy clay. Some with lots of straw incorporated, some with none. It's just such a wide range.
Sure. All right. Next question. What plant stage before flag leaf would you apply the first application of fungicide?
Oh, just say that again, Dennis.
What plant stage before the flag leaf? So at what stage of growth would you make your first application of fungicide?
Yeah. At growth stage 7, so when the second node is detectable, which coincides about with the third to last leaf, when that's fully emerged, that's when we're putting on the sort of penultimate fungicide before the flag leaf.
Okay, so that's stage 7 then.
Yes.
Okay, next question. Should we be increasing or decreasing our seeding rates compared to normal on our lighter soils versus heavier soils?
You get that question in the UK as well. We actually increase the seeding rate on heavier soil, mainly because we get poorer establishment. We get more slug problems. There's just less proportion of seeds actually make it to plants. So we increase the seed rate on heavy soils and decrease it on light soils. But that's all governed by plant establishment. We're trying to get the same number of plants regardless of soil type.
Yeah. Next question, and this may have been related to one of the current slides you had up. What was the base amount of N applied? I don't know if you can remember which.
No, this is on the farm standard, presumably.
I'm thinking so.
Yeah. See, it would have been a massive range.
Yeah.
You know, and we've also got some full applications of N in there as well.
For most,
so it's,
for most of the Michigan ones that I was familiar with, that base nitrogen rate was about 90 pounds of N.
Yeah.
So, but
that rings a bell, Dennis. Yeah.
It was different. Not every farm was the same.
No, not at all.
Okay. Next question.
So it's a big you know, when we're increasing the rate, you know, from 90 to 150 pounds of N per acre, that's a big increase. I mean, we recognise that, and we deliberately went big just to see what the potential size of the yield effect could be. I think one of the next steps really is, having proven that you can get more yield with more N, do you actually need 60 pounds to get that yield increase? It might be that you only need 40 or 50 or something like that, and you could still get 90% of that yield increase and be more cost effective. So there's more work to be done in that respect.
Right. Why are yields only 100-ish and not 150 to 190 or more in these trials? Are biologicals used to help with nutrient availability or nutrient available uptake, or is this supplemented with foliage or foliar applications?
I don't remember biologicals being used in a big way in any of the trials, really. And some of the trials did, you know, yield over 180 bushels, but they were kind of the exception rather than the rule, really. Yeah.
Okay. Is there a preferred source of nitrogen?
No, I mean, not really. I think it's important, if you're using urea, to protect it, to minimise volatilization. And I think nitrification inhibitors are useful as well to help to minimise losses. No, I mean, you can achieve these sorts of improvements with a range of nitrogen forms, really. Just be careful to protect the ones which are leaky types.
Yeah. Yep. Next question. You mentioned that one driver of yield is keeping the wheat greener longer, i.e. more photosynthesis. Have you done any test plots of adding some slow release nitrogen in the normal nitrogen application?
Yeah, we haven't, but the principle works. You know, that if you use a slow release nitrogen, that could help you to just give you a constant supply then, and help to retain those tillers during stem extension when quite a few crops are losing a lot of tillers. You know, typically a crop might lose 50% of its tillers between the start of stem extension and flowering. So by having a slow release fertilizer, you could well help to minimize that, but we haven't actually done any trials to prove that.
So that may be something for future work.
Definitely, yes.
Okay, do you feel a flag leaf fungicide is worth the cost for the product and the extra trip and adds to the yield? We are typically applying a fungicide with herbicide early in the season and a fungicide at heading, or the flowering fungicide.
Yeah, yes, I mean, this came up a lot in our discussions, that, you know, you can't compromise the flowering spray, and the flag leaf isn't far behind it. But our experiments all had a flowering spray, and we were still getting several bushels from the flag leaf spray. So, you know, when you look at the cost of the product and that sort of yield benefit, and if we, what's the price of wheat at the moment? $6, close to.
Yeah.
And I would say it does stack up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so usually, I mean, depending on wheat price, we're generally for a fungicide application somewhere in that 10 to 12 bushel cost.
Yeah.
You got to earn back 10 or 12 bushels in order to earn that. And I think you were saying we got about 15. So we were making, I mean, that's $18 an acre at $6 price. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it does.
Next question, is there any research on using Pivot Bioproven? And that's some product I'm not familiar with. Have you heard of that?
I'm not familiar with it either, no. I bet it's called a different name and we've used it in the UK, but I don't know it, I'm afraid.
Okay. What are the materials costs for each extra input? And I think that was related to the base rate and then the added fungicide, added nitrogen, and then the added PGR.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't remember, but we did do the sums to see if the yield benefit you get from both, which was between 10 and 14 bushels per acre on average, and it certainly more than paid for itself in terms of the extra cost of those inputs. So, it did stack up.
Mm-hmm. I think the only one where we weren't really seeing a big return was the PGR application.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, it didn't. That did not stack up. No, that's right.
The extra nitrogen and the fungicide were paying for itself. Yes.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. We're at 9:22. I'll ask you maybe a couple more, and then I'll help people get their credits, and then we'll come back and finish up. We still have, looks like 14 or so questions in the queue here. So. UK wheat growers, UK wheat grows for 10 to 11 months. Michigan wheat grows for about 5 months, 2 in the fall, 3 in the spring. Doesn't that have a huge impact on the value and timing of fungicides? Can we really achieve the benefit that the UK does?
It does, and you're right. And I think that the difference would be that you're just not going to need to put the fungicide on that we put on after flowering, because we've got about 40 days of wheat growing after flowering. I think you've got quite a lot less, so it's
25.
You wouldn't justify a fungicide after flowering, but I still think that the 2 fungicides during stem extension to protect those top 3 leaves are probably justified. It's a close call, at times. It depends on the season a bit, doesn't it? And just how hot the season is and how short that timing is. But the trials we've done, putting on a fungicide at week 7 and 9, certainly had a yield increase.
Yeah. So last year we had 30 days after flowering during the grain fill period that were above 85 degrees, which is what, 27 or 30 Celsius for you.
Yeah.
So weather can be a big problem for us.
Indeed. So I think that's where the big difference probably lies.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'll ask you one more and then we'll go to the credits and get wrapped up. Does the idea of keeping it green longer apply to other crops as well?
Yeah, it does. It does. I'm trying to think of which one it applies most to. We do a lot of work with canola, and that certainly applies there.
Are they using anything to delay senescence in the UK?
No, I would say not. Really, it's just good use of disease control to delay senescence.
Anything with like a late nitrogen application, like during say at flag leaf timing or anything like that?
We use late N for the milling wheat, and we'll apply about 40 pounds per acre, usually as a foliar application about a week or 2 after flowering. And that maximizes the protein content of the kernels. And that will just sort of extend the green area a little bit. But really, it's primarily good disease control.
Okay. What are the main differences in grain quality characteristics between feed wheat and milling wheat in the UK?
It's mainly the protein content. We need our feed wheats will probably only typically achieve 11 to 12% protein, well, even less, 10 to 11%. So we need 13%. So that's the main difference. But there's also gluten characteristics as well. And the varieties for bread are often usually much higher Hagberg falling number. It's mainly protein.
Are your wheats tend to be soft or hard or?
Soft, all soft.
All soft, okay.
Yeah.
Next question, has there been any research in narrow row or narrow slotting before?
No, this is the first stuff, and I feel like there's a disconnect between the machinery manufacturers and the sort of crop physiologists on this, really, because obviously, you know, there's an efficiency for having a wider slots. You know, if you've got a lot of trash, you can get through it quicker, can't you? But the downside is that it takes, you know, a week or two longer for the crop to reach full canopy closure if you've got wide rows. So I think we need to do a bit of work here.
Okay. When variable rate seeding wheat, so this would be controlling the seeding rate of wheat differently across the field. Do you seed at higher or lower populations in high yield potential areas?
I mean, when we do variable seed rates, we don't vary for yield potential. We vary for soil type, and that's it. And the reason being that when you look at yield maps and their consistency between seasons, they're not very consistent. You know, in a dry year, you find that the heavier land yields better. In a wet year, the heavier land yields worse, and you can't predict it. So it's quite difficult to do that. And I'm not sure what the rationale would be for altering the plant population for high and low yield areas anyway. So anyway, no, we don't, is the bottom line.
Okay, perfect. Next question. I usually want to see 1 tiller per plant, not 2. Is that, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, we have probably averages 2.5 to 3 tillers per plant would be typical. And we prefer more, really, because you just get sturdier plants. If we've got a crop with 1 tiller per plant, it would mean that we've got about a lot of plants per metre squared, and the lodging risk would be big. Mm-hmm. So we'd be worried about that, really. So, you know, ideally, we're looking for 2 to 3 tillers per shoot and quite big heads.
Okay, all right. Next question, is return on investment considered when applying the 3 or 4 passes of fungicide, or are you strictly looking at yield?
Oh, no, it's return on investment, definitely, all the time. Yeah. I mean, we're often going on with another product anyway, you see, on some of these. So there's often a saving in that respect. You know, so, but yeah, like you, all the farmers are only interested in the bottom line.
So do you, in terms of products for fungicides, do you have any, you know, like off-patent products that, you know, generic type things that are, you know, cheaper in terms of cost per acre for application?
Yes, we have a few. Well, we have a plant growth regulator called Chlormaquat, which is 50 years old now. Still a very effective product. You know, so we use a lot of that. That is the most commonly used plant growth regulator. Less opportunities on the fungicide front, I would say, because, you know, some of the products have developed resistance or insensitivity to diseases. So there's less scope there to use old products which are off patent and cheaper, really. But we know we still use sort of tebuconazole, for example, for rust control. That's effective.
Yep. Okay. Next question, can you discuss successful phosphorus management strategies? For example, looking at how do you bring together soil test P levels, interactions of soil test level versus application method, either banned via broadcast or broadcast rather. What's your
We're trying
overall?
to figure this out ourselves because we're finding that, you know, traditionally we've had a sort of soil index for phosphorus and a target, and it's 2. It won't be the same for you, but and targeted that, but it doesn't work that well in that some soils don't need as much phosphorus in the soil and can still achieve high yields, and some need more. What we've been turning our attention to now is testing retrospectively whether our crop was deficient for phosphorus by testing the grain. So if a grain has a phosphorus concentration of less than 0.3%, then it was deficient for phosphorus. And either it was because there wasn't enough phosphorus in the soil, or there was enough phosphorus in the soil, but it didn't have the root density, or the phosphorus wasn't available for plant uptake, causing the problem. Now, we use fresh phosphate in the spring for some crops, particularly ones on calcareous soil where there's P lockup. So that's one of the sort of approaches to be used. There are products out there which are claimed to help to make the phosphorus more available, and they're being used as well. Seed treatments to help the phosphorus in the soil be more available as well. Foliar applications, so you're bypassing the soil straight into the crop. You know, we're starting to develop a mantra of feed the crop, not the soil, because by putting it into the soil, there's a huge inefficiency. Things get locked up, it's difficult to get hold of. So moving straight into the crop is another approach. We're trying to figure things out on this, really. We haven't got all the answers, but those are the things we're looking at.
Okay. There's been some speakers that we've had previously that have really advocated for putting phosphorus in the furrow with seed when you plant.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. Yeah, placing the phosphorus with the seed is becoming much more common. Yeah, and you do see obvious effects from it as well. Yes.
All right. And then this is just a kind of a follow-up question to the slotting question. Do you think there'd be advantages in terms of managing water to doing that?
Like erosion and runoff and things like that?
Well, I think are conserving moisture in where you're dry is what I was thinking.
Yeah, there could be, yes. We don't usually have an issue with not enough water, so we don't worry about that.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, there could be. Yeah, I don't think I can comment very wisely on that though.
Okay, and then he just made a comment that he'll be slotting 1,500 acres of wheat this fall. So I'd be really curious to see, what that looks like and how that does. So yeah,
it'll be interesting. Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. Have dry matter analysis have dry matter analyses done to correlate yield? I'm not quite sure
Is that
how
the
that.
dry matter of the? I got the questions up as well. A dry matter analysis done to correlate yield. I mean, if that's the grain, the kernel dry matter, then we like you are sort of aiming for 13-15% moisture content, but we don't see any correlation there. Often for the very highest yielding crops, I mean, for example, the world record holder, some of his leaves are still green when the kernels were fit to harvest. So a real challenge to actually combine it because the stuff was still green. He was too effective at keeping his canopy green. So sometimes it can be, a challenge.
Yeah. Next question, what are the most common fungicides applied?
Yeah, well, we're using a combination of azoles and SDHI products. So we use Xemium, for example, that you use. Pyraclostrobin is a commonly used active, but there's a whole range. We're very conscious about resistance management and making sure that keeping the fungicides working for as long as possible and not allowing insensitivity to develop. Yep. So we're only allowed to use 2 SDHI products on any one crop, and we have to mix and match with the azoles. We've just lost our best multi-site fungicide called chlorophenol, and that's been not available to us anymore. So we've only now got one multi-site fungicide called Folpet. So we're using as wide a range of products as we can.
Okay. Next question, I've been applying 100 pounds of nitrogen at green up as urea and adding 28% just before flag leaf emerges at 36 pounds. Would splitting 28% improve yield and maybe increase the rate of N both prior to flag leaf?
Yeah, I think, yes, it can. When you put nitrogen on at flag leaf, the work we've done has shown that it can increase yield. it would be good to put that dose on a little bit earlier in some ways. I think it would have a better chance of having a bigger effect on yield if that late dose was applied slightly earlier.
Okay. All right. And then there was just a comment back about where Pivot Bio is a biological end source that's been advertised for corn and soybeans. So yeah, that's not one
I
that
don't
I've
know
heard
it,
of.
I must admit. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then your last question is a comment. Excellent webinar.
Thank you.
So,
I hope everybody thought so. Yeah.
yes. So thank you very much. This has been very informative. You did a great job as always, and really appreciate you taking the time to visit with us.
It's been a pleasure, and I've really enjoyed all the questions and discussions that's come after as well, because I always learn a lot from these things as well. So no, it's been very, very entertaining. Thank you.
And I'm really glad you mentioned the end, because we're working really hard right now to get our yield enhancement network off the ground and going here. And we're just about there, ready for farmers to start entering their data into the online database. So
that sounds great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah,
stuff.
fantastic.